Welcome back, everyone, to the Golden Queers by the Outwords Archive. Howdy, howdy there, Jay. How are you doing today?
Oh, you know I'm swell as can be. Ready to hear some more queer stories, though. We've got more incredible stories on deck. How are you, though, MR?
I am fine and dandy, my friend. Fine and dandy.
I see you painted your nails for the occasion.
Of course I did. Gotta be glittery all the time. I see you got your beautiful acrylics on for the occasion. Wink. But even though we both look fabulous, what I'm most excited for is today's story. We'll be in conversation with Mia Yamamoto, a trans woman, Japanese-American criminal defense attorney, and civil rights activist who's based in LA.
Mia is such an inspiration, so let's do it up.
Mia's story starts right now.
Being a transgender person today is extraordinarily important. I think it's important to be as open and notorious as I can be in order to make sure that I elevate the profile of the issue and be willing to speak to whatever opposition or advocacy is out there. In 1952, I'm a child who believes I'm the only person in the world who has this particular affliction because I live in a very small universe, at least at that time. 1952 was when Christine Jorgensen was the first male to female sex change operation. He came back from, I think, Denmark, someplace in Scandinavia, and was going to undergo a series of operations to achieve that. And took the paper into my mom, showed it to her, and I was so jubilant thinking that I'm just not alone. There's one other person in the universe. And of course, it's a scandal, And she just started crying. She took one look at me and looked at the article and then just started crying. And I remember just determined I will never do that to her ever again. But I also understood that this is something that took away from my value as a person somehow. And that somehow it made her unhappy that she had this kid with this problem. And I buried it. I remember thinking that almost very consciously, just burying that as deep as I could push it. And it's a very common experience among trans folks, as a matter of fact, from my lifelong inquiries about this issue. Being a lawyer and being a trial lawyer in particular, which is somewhat public and very much a performance or craft, to go from male to female in that milieu is far more in your face than it is to announce that you're either a lesbian or gay person, of which I now am all of that. But early on, I had to go to all my clients and tell them I'm going to be transitioning. I'm going to be going from male to female, and that's something of a bait and switch. So I told them, look, I'm going to be going through a sex change. And I know enough about how the world treats trans people that, if you can't agree with that, fine. I understand. I know some of the best lawyers in LA. You will be well served. They were astonishingly embracing of me continuing as their lawyers across the board. And I was very moved by that, actually, that they would continue to have faith. I had a death penalty client. The embrace I got from both him and my community was absolutely amazing. I knew I'd get a little bit of pushback here. It's like, if you're going to be the first one, you're going to have to see some unique reactions. I didn't want to be a litmus test for the bigots, but I sort of became one. And that was fine. I mean, because I'm the kind of person that can talk back to people, I remember the night before I was going to go to court the next morning dressed, that I'm saying I'm going to liberate the criminal courts building tomorrow morning. And after I do that, I'm going to liberate the jail. And then I'm going to liberate the DA's office and the police stations. And I was absolutely amazed at the positive response I got from everybody. Some of the nicest responses I got were from the bailiffs. The law enforcement was amazingly cool. Absolutely not something I expected. I heard about people talking smack about me, making jokes, etc. I expected that. But that didn't bother me at all. But the judges were interesting because I wrote all of them letters, every one of them. And I said, look, I'm going to be going through a sex change. And this has never happened in the history of the courts. And I want you to know if it's going to be a problem, if you can see this being something that prejudices my client, then I want off the case. You make the call, Judge. I'm just putting it out in front of you. This is what I'm doing. This is what's going to happen. If it's unacceptable, please let me know as early as possible. Not a single one of them responded. I had to sort of put the squeeze on him to get him to tell me something, you know. I had a death penalty case, and I'm fighting this case, and I'm going to court, and I'm dressed, and he doesn't seem to notice, the judge that is. And this judge is the hanging judge at the criminal courts building, bail pounders. And he hears the case, listens to arguments, makes his ruling, then he sets the case for another date. And I'm saying, hold it, Judge. I wrote you a letter. And I don't want to make too much of a big deal out of this, but in the letter I told you I've been going through a sex change. This is a death penalty case, Your Honor. If this is going to prejudice my client, I'm putting it on the record right now. I want you to take me off the case. My client's life is on the line. This is nothing to take lightly by any of us. And he said, I read the article about you in the paper. And he said, when I read the part where you said, if you couldn't die as a woman, you couldn't feel like you had actually lived. And he started to choke up, this hanging judge. It was really an astonishing moment. And I realized that this whole thing hits people, and sometimes in a very sympathetic way. I didn't think I'd ever get that. But after I came out, there was an article done on the front page of the daily legal paper, and that was the best thing that could have happened. I didn't have to come out to 5,000 people all at once. Boom, the paper explained everything. After that article came out, I'd come to court, and people would be lined up at the bar to give me a hug and a kiss. The women were like, welcome to the club. The guys were like, I got your back, homie. It was amazing to see how little I had expected from them, really. So for them to come up like that, to get such a uniform embrace, was completely unexpected and completely welcome, I have to say.
That's so amazing. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit about this. And I'm curious because we both live here in California, if you think that there's like something in particular about living in California about how this affected the openness and it sounds like celebration once you transitioned in this particular law community that you were a part of.
No, it was terrific. I mean, that's not to say there weren't some naysayers and people trying to ridicule my transition and everything. I expected that. I just expected a lot more, frankly. You know, and actually, some opposition came from some really weird places. I had an Asian American woman lawyer friend. She was one of my best friends for years. And she turned on me very publicly over my transition. I think she was saying some things that a lot of people might be thinking, which is, you know, what right do I have to call myself a woman when I haven't gone through the struggles that they have gone through to get to where they are? And I have no answer for that. I can understand that feeling, but my struggles with just being transgender weren't easy either. Getting to where I am and to get that kind of response is truly disheartening, certainly coming from a friend, but the public sort of denunciation, it didn't do her much good, believe me. I mean, after this big public statement, it was like a delegation of young people. It looked like college kids. And they all walked up to me and they said, what is wrong with that woman? So it really felt good that they understood that this was really kind of out of line. But that was the most disappointing about it, because just about everybody else, I mean, I reached a level of detente with the rest of my family, the people that are really, in the end, the most important to you, really. As far as I can tell, as far as I knew at the time, certainly there had never been a transgender trial lawyer any place in the state, certainly. And I never really looked any further, but the people tell me that I'm probably the only one in the country. So when you're the first person that does something, there's a couple different things. First of all, you have no roadmap. You have no role models. There's no way you can compare yourself to somebody else and maybe even choose their path. You are the path. And it's going to be a very public and open, and in my case, very notorious. I think that I needed to be as high profile as possible in order to be the most help. You anticipate all kinds of awful things. For me, anyway, I went to the courthouse dressed as a woman after 20, 30 years of going there, that same place, and doing that same thing in a suit and tie. And I had to inflict at least that shock upon my community. And that's the only way that that door was ever going to get opened. And there would be a path for anybody else behind me. And sure enough, they came out of the woodwork after I started. And that's really gratifying. I feel like I did make room for them. It wasn't as tough for them as long as I was out there taking all the heat. So I think being an Asian American, and particularly being a Japanese American, having been born in a concentration camp for Japanese Americans, it does tend to stigmatize you. At some point, you come away from the whole experience of your country and your community feeling damaged, feeling like there's something wrong with you. That why did we warrant the concentration camps? Why did we warrant atomic bombs? Is there something wrong with being Japanese? Did we deserve these punishments? And if we do, if we are flawed and broken in that way, what can we do about it? Is there any hope? So I think a lot of minority people, just period, you start with a certain amount of self-hatred that's fed by the sort of surrounding environment, which encourages that kind of discrimination. You sort of become a part of it and you start discriminating in a way against yourself. I think that a whole bunch of things have to come to light with this struggle, but part of the intersectionality of it is tied to, in my case, not just being the first transgender trial lawyer, but being the first Asian Americans in the courthouse to begin with. We were always either mistaken for the clients or for interpreters when we first became lawyers and started working in the trial court. So being the first ones, for me, has always felt the burden of responsibility. I had to be as good as I can get. And that mattered in law school, it mattered in the courts, it mattered as Asian Americans started to enter the profession, that if I was even mediocre, I was going to be confirming certain people's expectations, low expectations for Asian Americans in the law. And I had to be the best I could possibly be. I could not be a schlep. I couldn't be a really bad example of what I should be. It was not only incumbent upon me, it was a burden that I felt like I was carrying for a lot of other people, and for not just Asian American people.
There's so much in Mia's story to unpack, but one thing that really stands out to me is here when she's talking about having to be the first in her position, meaning the first Asian American trans trial lawyer, and having to set the example herself after not having an example set before her. She's so fearless in the way she reflects on this time, and it makes me think about how we as younger queer folks do have queer and trans role models, for lack of a better term, purely because we're born at a later date. It also makes me feel all tingly to imagine that young queer and trans folks have Mia to look up to, whether they're wanting to be lawyers or are Asian American trans youth or queer youth more broadly. Knowing that Mia is out there organizing gives me a lot of hope.
Gosh, a common theme in many of the episodes in the series, we're having conversations with many people who've had this kind of quote-unquote the first to many, if not all, the things they've experienced. But for Mia in particular, it really, really warms my heart that us and even younger queer folks can have a role model like her and say, yeah, I can be queer, non-binary, transgender, POC, and have a kick-ass job in any field or industry. Because when I think about being professional as a queer youth, I was so fearful of my sexuality coming out. I didn't want to be labeled. I didn't want to label myself. I didn't want to put myself at a quote-unquote disadvantage because I wasn't het. Literally, it's quite honestly the saddest thing to say.
Oof, yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Jae. It's bonkers to think that you had to live in fear of being outed and that your being queer could potentially put you at a disadvantage, as you shared. And for Mia, she also had to grab the bull by the horns, as she's describing when she transitioned, because her outwards appearance was then in alignment with her gender after decades of working in the same place. She then has to constantly explain herself and her journey to colleagues, and even ask judges if her transness would affect the outcome of her cases. So she was still thinking of her clients and serving her community, even while cohering her identity with her job. It's remarkable. And on that note, let's dive back in. You mentioned here, like, being the first and wanting to have being the first be a path forward for other Asian American folks and Asian American trans folks and trans women and just trans folks in general in the courtroom. So I'm curious what work you've done within the field to lay that groundwork that was not laid down for you, given that you were the first, but how you've been laying it down for other younger folks in the field of law.
Well, I'm as public as I can possibly be. And my transition was as public as high profile in many ways as it could possibly be. So that example, I feel like, has actually affected people. The other part of it is, yeah, that's my message. I now go far and wide preaching that message of inclusion, tolerance, and diversity. All those things that people talk about are always going to be important. And my voice as a representative of the community, I'm responsible for conveying values of humanity, inclusion, and collaboration. The community itself is so minuscule relative to other communities, even within the LGBT community, that we don't have any leverage in the numbers, and we are an obvious target politically. It's already been demonstrated, I think, recently. So we need to be part of a larger movement. I have always been a part of the civil rights movement. My dad was a member of the NAACP. My dad was a member of the ACLU. I've been an ACLU lifer. I'm involved in a whole bunch of civil rights, I guess, and human rights movement. My major nonprofit is International Bridges to Justice. We are a international human rights organization that's devoted to defending prisoners all over the world. We support the defenders who are defending prisoners in a lot of embattled places. And just give you one example. I remember this one young woman in Syria. She's talking about trying to go visit her clients in jail, and she has to dodge IEDs, snipers, and as she put it, Assad's bombs, while she's trying to go about her business of advancing the interests of her clients. And in Myanmar, the defenders are facing a military dictatorship, and their colleagues are out in the streets fighting back against the troops, while in the courtrooms they're being tried, and the defenders want to be in the streets, but they can't. They have to represent them in the courthouse. They have to maintain some level of neutrality in order to argue to the courts for their release. In any event, that's what I do. And I think a lot of that has come from maybe where I was born, how I was brought up, the goals, and for me, the purpose of employing my education in some productive fashion points me in that direction. So I'm grateful for it. I feel like, I'm doing the work I was probably born to do. I feel like, my dad died when I was 13, so he had no idea that I was ever going to become a lawyer. I lived the youth of a typical queer kid, which meant that it wasn't going to last very long anyway. So why give a damn? It's like, I'm queer. I'm completely outside the mainstream. Everybody hates me. I'm not going to last very long, so I'm not going to bother with an education. I certainly did not until I came back from the army, essentially. The suicidal ideation recurring, and watching your friends die, watching the people that you know from the community taking their own lives, really common. On occasion, somebody gets murdered, usually for being trans. There's a whole litany of people that you lose in the community, to transphobia, to homophobia. These things kill. And for the most part, too, they seem to implicate people that themselves are struggling with either their own gender identity or their own sexual orientation, who are fighting so hard against themselves that they have to take it out on other people. So the community, we live next door to a certain kind of white supremacy that I advocate against, and I don't mind advocating against it. And I always tell you right now, I love white people. And I believe that white supremacy as a concept is damaging to white people. And if they understood that, then we all can do something about it. It exists, it is harmful, it is exclusionary, and it distorts people's view of themselves in reality in damaging ways. So that message is that, yes, we are all part of a larger movement, including transgender people, including all queer people. We should be part of a larger movement that advances all of our interests to the point where we all achieve some measure of equality and some measure of justice. But it can't be done alone. And I've learned that a long time ago. Our tiny little community, we have to have allies. No minority movement ever succeeds without allies. That means we got to be good allies too. Not only do we have to convince our allies of the justice in our cause, but we have to stand up when their rights are threatened. And I think right now, especially, I'm a transgender woman, and I'm probably never going to have any kids, certainly not from my own body. But this issue of abortion is extraordinarily important on so many levels, because it is an effort by the right wing to roll back all of the rights that the civil rights movement has fought so hard to achieve. And I believe the right to an abortion is part and parcel of that movement. And the rights of women have to be upheld by men. And they also have to be upheld by women of conscience And I mean conscious beyond whatever their political affiliation is or their religious affiliation. This is a question of human rights. Women's rights are human rights, and that means it's everybody's business. Our whole society collapses when we target and dictate destruction for one segment of our community. To me, that is Nazi politics. And we can't afford to go back to the 1940s, despite the efforts of some people to take us back there.
This is a really powerful, powerful statement. And I'm really glad that you brought this up. And I mean, just hearing about it makes me feel like so proud to know about the work that you've been doing. And so I want to turn that question over to you and just ask, like, is there a particular moment or moments, I'm sure there's been many, that you feel proud of, maybe how you were able to connect with a client or provide services for a client that may not otherwise have received service?
In terms of the free work I do, I'm very proud of the work I do for protesters and demonstrators. I've made a career of that. After I left the public defender's office, one of the things I wanted to make sure I did was to be able to represent the people that get arrested for protesting and for demonstrating against injustice, against war, against racism. I wanted to be able to be the lawyer that went into court and said, I'm representing this person. And that part of what I've been doing has been fulfilling. I don't think she would mind me telling you this, but I've represented and been a lawyer for Melina Abdullah, the leader of Black Lives Matter. I feel very honored to be able to be on that defense team. But be able to have freedom is part of what's really important in terms of the way I look at my life, and to have the freedom of choice, to be able to take a client, no matter how unpopular, for instance, and no matter what enemy might think about it, and even if the person's guilty, even if the person needs somebody to get a break in sentencing, I've got to find out some way to make sure that the person isn't punished more than he should be, that kind of thing. So for me, there's little victories that I get through the process, but I'm not sure somebody outside the criminal defense attorney network would appreciate it as much as I do. Let's put it that way. But let me just say that I left the public defender's office after 10 years there. I love being a public defender. I still love all public defenders, but they're not free to take the cases they want. They just get assigned whatever they get, and they roll out there and they take care of it. And that's great. But I always felt like if I was going to be a lawyer, I wanted to be able to serve the poor. That's why I started working off at Legal Aid. And I went to the public defender's office, and I loved working for the same people. They just had different legal problems that I was going to be able to deal with. But the issues were so immediate and they were so interesting that I could absolutely lose myself to the service towards their cause. I loved doing it, but I loved the choice.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And as we start to wrap things up today, what messages would you like to leave for future generations of trans kids, Asian American trans kids, or even Asian American trans trial lawyers?
Everybody wants you to be what they think is the ideal for the purpose you think you're trying to achieve. And it never works. So I think what I tell people basically is be yourself and be brave, because it takes some courage to fight through the fear that most people have of being authentic. And so, as with respect to Asian American people, I feel like it's the same thing. We have a long legacy going all the way back to our homelands, just like every other human being in this country. And it is faulting in many ways your community and your culture not to look back and understand that you have ancestors that fought and sacrificed and burdened themselves and made the effort and sacrificed a lot to get to where you are today. And to just always be mindful of the fact that none of this happens alone, that we all need community. We need each other to achieve anything. The great Frederick Douglass once said, when he fought against slavery, it was for himself. When he fought against racial discrimination, it was for his people. But when he fought for the rights of women, he found some nobility there. And there's a message there for every ally, especially on that level. A man fighting for the rights of women, particularly today when this particular fight is upon us, is so significant, so important, and so timely. So I just want to send out that message to all of us who come from minority communities, people of color, queer people. We need each other. Look for the justice in the causes that are all around you, and don't shrink back from them. Be a part of them. March with us, speak with us. Even if you say nothing, carry a sign. let the government know where we stand, that we stand for principle, not politics, and we stand for people above property.
Very powerful message. Thank you so much. To wind us down, if you had the opportunity to sit with your younger self here today, what would you want to say to yourself?
I would say don't give up. You're giving up. You're letting life pass you by. You think sticking your head under your pillow and spending your life in darkness is the only place you'll ever have to be yourself.
And you will actually find true love.
And you will eventually find true love. There's hope. If you think that the only way through life is to somehow or other do what everybody else is doing, you're wrong.
Something that stands out to me from all these conversations is that when folks find their passion for serving their queer and trans communities or their communities where they live, they don't stop for a moment, even when they themselves are going through big personal changes. Mia's story is a testament to a life dedicated to service and care for her community. And within that care is the care to show up for herself while she came out to her law community as trans, knowing that she was setting the path for future trans youth.
Damn. Okay, boo, go off.
We'll be back next time. Until then, besitos from us. The Golden Queers is produced, hosted, and edited by Jae Singh and M.R. Raquel, with music provided by Karl Casey at White Bat Audio. Find The Golden Queers online at thegoldenqueers.org. Executive producers for the Outwords Archive are Jack MacCarthy and Bliss, and Outwords' executive director is Mason Funk. Outwords captures, preserves, and shares the stories of LGBTQ+ elders to build community and catalyze social change. More info at theoutwordsarchive.org. That's Outwords, WORDS. The Golden Queers is funded by a generous grant from the California State Library's Oral History Project. Special thanks to this week's storyteller, Mia Yamamoto.